I think that good engineers almost always see the language itself as an implementation detail. Just like with human languages, almost every concept can be expressed in almost every language. And I think that almost any engineer that you'd want to be hiring at an early stage startup wouldn't be intimidated by the fact that they didn't know a language. And so I think that that can be a really good signal for whether or not a candidate is a potential good hire.
What are some of the personality traits that adapt well from engineers that are going into a startup environment? If it's Series A, Series B, early stage going into high growth mode, what are some of those personality traits that tend to flourish?
I love playing with new programming languages, new technologies. The time to do that is not when you're building out a Series A startup. The best thing that you can do for yourself and for the company that you work for when you're at an early stage company is take technologies that you're familiar with and that you enjoy working with. And that can be a balance. It might not be your favorite language, but it's one that you're good at and you know the ins and outs of, or might not be your favorite database system, but it's already set up. Fragmenting when you're at that early stage does a couple things. It makes hiring harder because there's more surface area that you need to cover with each hire. And then it also makes any refactoring, which is really common at early stage companies, much more difficult. You sort of lock yourself into these interfaces between the various tools and languages that you're working with. And the more interfaces that need to change, the more effort goes into needing to change them and the more time it takes, which then disincentivizes changing them. And it gets into this negative feedback loop where you're trying to build your way out of a problem that you built yourself into, keeping things as simple as possible and just going with your gut often serves you really well. I mentioned earlier about working at Alidade, that learning to make decisions and then living with the consequences of those decisions, good or bad, is a great skill to become familiar with. It's absolutely possible to practice those outside of a work environment. You can spin up a quick side project, play the PM and say, oh, this is the new requirement. We need to change the side project to do this. And think about how the decisions you made in the early stages affect your ability to implement those changes. Because anything's possible, especially early stage companies tend to pivot, and your value to the company is immensely magnified when the answer can truthfully be, yeah, we can do that, no problem, versus, oh no, I got us into a situation where we can't.
Yeah, I think that's extremely valuable feedback. We oftentimes see a lot of hiring managers being a little bit more open to maybe polyglot style engineers. What are your thoughts on bringing folks in on tech that isn't your immediate tech stack and training those folks in those different tools, frameworks, libraries, languages? Is that something that is more of a time suck, or is that something that you would say is worth the investment?
I think that good engineers almost always see the language itself as an implementation detail. Just like with human languages, almost every concept can be expressed in almost every language. They're all pretty similar at the end of the day. They just have different advantages and drawbacks. Python, super flexible, super quick to write, really terse, but on the other hand, not particularly performant. If you're doing some high performance data processing pipelines that need to ingest many gigabytes of data per second, maybe not Python, but it'll work. Computers are cheap these days. And I think that almost any engineer that you'd want to be hiring at an early stage startup wouldn't be intimidated by the fact that they didn't know a language. And so I think that that can be a really good signal for whether or not a candidate is a potential good hire. On the other side of that coin, when it comes to the other technologies that might be in use, if you need someone who's really strong with databases and has only ever done front-end web development, that's a tough road. It's absolutely doable, but you need to be prepared for someone to take a couple months to really get up to speed with the responsibilities that you've given them. And I think that also requires a lot more investment to build up someone's skill set there. But it's also a big advantage if the company's willing to do that. Engineers are often the type that really like to learn, and demonstrating the willingness to invest in someone's skill set buys you some loyalty.
Yeah, loyalty being a very important trait in today's market.
Yeah, absolutely.
Given the shelf life of engineers being anything between a year and a half to 2 years before they're on to the next gig. And what is it that you can do to keep them around long term,
Yeah.
investing in some of that training? I'm curious, are there go-to online courses that engineers tend to drift towards? Obviously, now we're in a remote world. What outlets for engineers specifically have been super helpful to learn new trades or new skills?
I think a great and often undervalued one is the free option of contributing to open source projects. Almost every engineer uses at least some open source tools. They almost all will have a backlog on GitHub or GitLab, whatever their version control system is, that says, these are all the bugs that people have reported, or all the feature requests. Go in there, knock a couple out. That'll give you a really good understanding of the technologies that they use, and the technologies that you may be presented with at a new job are often easy to find in those open source tools, because people are building their open source projects with the latest and greatest is the wrong word, but they're not using COBOL and Fortran. They're using more modern databases and some of the more popular languages. Alternatively, starting your own project can be a great way. Like I mentioned earlier, there's no deadline, there's no PM. You can just sit there and wait until the code compiles. That can be a great outlet for both learning and for sort of expelling some of the creative energy that might not get let out every week at work. And books, of course.
Have you ever done any Kaggle days or like coding challenges?
Never.
I've heard those are interesting, obviously for like the data science or the data centric engineer, because it gives them access to large data sets that they might not have access to in a smaller company.
Yeah, I've heard they can be really valuable. Another thing that a lot of companies look at these days is one's rank on LeetCode. That is something that I personally am not a big fan of. The algorithms on LeetCode often follow a pattern. Once you learn how to do the algorithms and data structures that LeetCode requires, it's more about regurgitating stored knowledge as opposed to thinking through the specifics of a problem. And so when I'm coming up with interview questions, I try to make the process as close to a miniaturized version of what one might encounter in their day-to-day.
It's good intel. There's so many new coding tools or programming exercises that are popping up left and right. Is there one that you all use specifically at Color that has been helpful?
Yeah, we use a code interview. It's pretty cool. The left side is an editor. They've got a ton of languages in there. And the right side is the code execution pane. And so for Python, it might be an interactive Python shell. For other languages, it might be the compiler output, but it lets everybody type at all times. So the interview process can be collaborative. I think that's really valuable. I especially like giving interviews where the interviewer is playing the role of a PM a little bit, providing requirements and asking the interviewee to implement something. It'll be small, but it's all about the thought process and how people approach problems. You can pull a lot of signal out of that.
And then do you share that feedback with the engineers of how they performed, if it's good or bad?
We do not share it with the engineers. The recruiters will synthesize the feedback and say the engineers were really excited with your performance or things along those lines if it's going well. But the people who do the interviews, we aggregate all that feedback so everybody can see the code outputted by another engineer's interviewee. And then there's a big debrief where the whole panel gets together and says, oh, they did this really well in my interview, but they didn't do this so well in this interview. Weigh the good and the bad and come up with a decision.
Cool. One thing that came up in Alidate a couple of times too was when building out an engineering team, when to plug and play certain layers. When you get to 20 engineers and you don't have a middle layer between a CTO and a lead, you might be in some trouble at this point. I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's really tough for any person to manage more than about 5 people. And I think that basically once you've got about 8 to 10 engineers, so you've got 2 engineering teams with 2 leads. The CTO probably has other direct reports as well, like maybe the head of product management, the head designer. They're starting to run out of capacity to manage people. And so about 10 engineers is when you start wanting to think about someone to manage the engineering team exclusively, be that a VP of engineering or a director of engineering. But before that, that might be a little premature.
It's always tough to batch that in, but really it translates over just in general managing people. Like, when are you starting to overlook folks, or when are people not given the attention they deserve?
One thing that people often overlook is that if you wait until it feels like you can't live without one, not only is it too late, but it's way too late, because at that point, you've probably got so many direct reports under various individuals that they're going to have a hard time making the space to do a search for that engineering leader or leader of whichever department it happens to be. But that's a really hard job to fill in the first place. Good candidates for engineering leadership roles are not a dime a dozen. And trying to hire someone when you're already slammed and you've got 10 or 12 direct reports and 38 hours of meetings a week, squeezing in a couple hours for interviews a week, it's going to take you a really, really long time to find someone. And so thinking a couple steps ahead, starting that process when you've got the capacity to execute on it is key. You've got to feel it out, but I would say it's better to be a little too eager and hire that person a little too early than it is to wait until it's too late.
We could talk for hours on that one, but I'll say, Jeff, thanks for so much for your time. This is really helpful for the community, and appreciate you pitching your 2 cents here. Thanks for joining us on the Hatchpad.
Absolutely. Great chatting with you, and talk to you soon.
Sounds good.